Moses took. Sinner, run, hide your face. Sinner, run, hide your face. Run to the rock to hide your face. The rock cries out, no hiding place. Crying holy unto the Lord. Crying holy unto the Lord. Oh, if I could, I surely would stand on the rock where Moses stood.
And welcome to the latest episode of PresbyCast. Most of you, I'm sure, are staying up for the start of March Madness, and the rest of you demented weirdos are staying up late for the start of PresbyCast. So either way, we appreciate you being here. Presbyterian, Chortles Weekly, is on the other side of the virtual table, as it were, along with our guest as well. I guess I'll throw it right over to Chortles, let him introduce our guest, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Well, I'm sure podcast consultants would tell you not to do two shows that are really similar back to back or that are mirror images of one another, but that's exactly what we're doing. Last week we talked to Harrison Perkins, an American who finds himself in London serving a free church congregation, and tonight we have, the former pastor of that London free church congregation who is now at a little chapel called First Pres Jackson over in Mississippi. Pastor David Strain, are you with us there?
Yes, sir. Good to be with you, Chortles.
It is good to be with you. So you've come a long way.
Yes, sir.
And you heard me say this, but I did visit your church in 2008, and I found that. Oh yes, you were. It was just a few months before you left. It would have been January of 2008.
Wow. Well, let me apologize for whatever I said from the pulpit.
I remember this. As I said on the last show, I remember the sermon was perfectly fine in my opinion, and I do remember you and your children and your wife, who has a very Scottish name, Sheena.
Yep.
You all were collecting the cushions from the pews after the service. I seem to remember.
All right, then.
And this tells you...
I don't have that whatsoever, but...
Well, there you go. You've been busy.
Sounds like it, yeah.
And this will sort of tell us how much, the Young, Restless, and Reformed have changed since then. I picked up a copy of the monthly Record, the Free Church magazine, from your book table. And guess who was on the cover in late 2007, early 2008?
Chortles Weekly.
And he was wearing a shark tooth necklace. Does that help any?
A shark necklace?
Mark Driscoll.
Mark Driscoll. Wow. Yeah, that's a train wreck, that whole story was a train.
Come on, there's no need to speak so ill of trains.
I think actually part of what that was the sort of excitement of discovering somebody who sounded edgy and was attractive to young people, but who was openly a Calvinist. And I think maybe for some in the UK scene, which is so post-Christian, that was just exciting. And, we've seen this happen over and over and over again, haven't we? People who become celebrities then flame out after a while, and we're all left to pick up the pieces and wondering why we were so quick to celebrate them. And that's certainly the case here, isn't it?
Yeah, and I remember the article being balanced. It was just, in 2008, I probably didn't have the same opinion of him I did a few years later, but I did think it was interesting, of course. So tell us a bit about yourself. We know where you are now.
Yeah,
we know where you were in 2008, but you're from Glasgow, which is a different place than Edinburgh. I mean, it occurred to me, I was thinking about it today. East London and Glasgow are analogous in a way that West London and Edinburgh are probably. So maybe you were at home in East London, where you were, But tell us, just to make Carl Truman mad, tell us about your authentically broken faith journey.
Yeah, I'll just tell a quick story about Carl Truman first. He spoke at my
please.
My installation in Columbus, Mississippi, when I moved here, and he would stay with us when he visited London some, and so we asked him to preach at my installation, and he said to the congregation, "I know you all think, because of his accent and all that, he's more intelligent than he really is." He says, "But I think he sounds like a Black & Decker power tool." So thanks, Carl. So Glasgow is a more industrial it's really post-industrial now, but it was a major shipbuilding industrial kind of city, and so it's more working class maybe than Edinburgh, although I love and lived in Edinburgh for 4 years and loved living there. Have very happy memories of being at what was the Free Church College and is now Edinburgh Theological Seminary. But yeah, I trained originally for the ministry in the Church of Scotland, which is the main line, like the PCUSA. So the people that really shaped me were Eric Alexander, who was the minister of St. George's Tron, and to a lesser extent, although still very impactful, was Sinclair Ferguson. Those were the men in the Church of Scotland that had a huge formative influence on me in terms of what I thought about preaching and ministry. And I was kicked out of the Church of Scotland because...
Oh, that's good.
Because I was in a placement, like an internship that the church assigned to me, which they do for all the students training for ministry in the Church of Scotland. They assign them. You don't have any kind of liberty on that. And because they knew I was an evangelical, they sent me to liberal parishes to work with women preachers. And I made it through 3 years of seminary with almost no evangelicals on the student body or the faculty that I can recall. And the very last placement, so the last internship that I did, was with a lovely lady minister who was very, very liberal. We had a pretty good relationship. We would preach turnabout. I would preach the gospel one Sunday and she would preach Jesus was a nice guy and you should be nice too. And then we would meet on Monday and talk about it, and she would call me a fascist and I would call her a screaming liberal, and we would get along great. We had a very sort of honest, direct relationship until the very end of that placement. She sort of stopped and said, "What about the ordination of women?" Which was kind of the game that everyone played at that time in the Church of Scotland. That's the question you just don't ask. And I started to try and fudge the question, and something inside of me just sort of gave, it just broke. And I said, "Look, I can't ordain a woman. I can't work with women elders or women teaching elders. I couldn't work with men or women who don't believe in basic credo Christianity." And so one thing led to another. I was reported to the presbytery. They asked me to resign. I said, I think I won't resign. I think you need to remove me, because I think I'm actually standing where Presbyterians have stood. And if this is where the Church of Scotland is, I'd like it to be shown to be, this is where it is. And so they had a presbytery meeting and they read out a statement of my views, and it was a fairly carefully crafted statement that I was not allowed to contribute to. They framed the statement of my views in a pretty provocative way, and I was removed from the Church of Scotland. That was pretty devastating. And at that time, my wife is from a Free Church of Scotland background. My father-in-law, is an elder in the Free Church of Scotland, a ruling elder. And so I applied and was welcomed into the Free Church, and did a couple of years at Edinburgh Theological Seminary. It was the Free Church College at the time. From there, I was called to be the pastorate at what used to be called Cole Abbey Presbyterian Church. It's now London City Presbyterian Church. That name changed during my time there. They had just moved to a new location shortly before I arrived.
So that was your first free church
Yeah.
assignment. Okay. So a couple of questions. Well, one observation. You were convicted of being a Presbyterian, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
There are some people that I can think of that couldn't be convicted of Presbyterianism. So that's good. I think, and I'm sort of a mind that it's better to be run out than to slink off. And you came to that conviction.
I agree.
Well.
Although, it was framed as I was trying to reopen debates that the denomination had already long settled on the ordination of women. And actually, that's not at all what I was trying to do. I knew that there was no way for this lowly candidate for the ministry to suddenly, turn back the clock on those matters. But what I did think about was the men that I admired and sought to follow, who were sitting in that presbytery meeting, who shared my convictions. And that if I simply slunk away, then nothing would be on the record. But if the presbytery had to vote to remove me, they would at least allow them an opportunity to dissent and clear their conscience. I won't say who was there, and I won't say whether anyone dissented.
Yeah, and it sounds like your trial was about as fair as Machen's trial.
It was a brutal experience. In fact, there were when the part about women's ordination was read out, the women elders and others there were catcalls and jeers and shouting in the presbytery meeting. It was a really, I'm sitting in the balcony, sort of slunk down, really horrified and very embarrassed. It was a most uncomfortable experience.
Well, I didn't know any of that. So were you viewed with suspicion by some people in the Free Church, or did they really welcome you?
No, the Free Church
universally
was wonderfully welcoming. And, the Free Church is a much smaller denomination. It's a still largely Highland denomination. And yet I found them to be incredibly hospitable. I found them, it felt like coming home at last. It felt like coming up for air after having taken too deep a dive for too long. Here I was with people who loved the Word of God, who wanted me to preach it without equivocation, who were committed to the standards, but hadn't just discovered the Westminster Confession. There were no cage stage Calvinists. They've been around that block for a long time, and they knew their convictions, and they were relaxed and happy, and they had just come through a split. So I came into the Free Church after the Free Church Continuing withdrew in 2000. And I'm very grateful that I came in after all of that was settled rather than coming into the middle of it. And so I found a home in the Free Church, and in lots of ways, the piety that I was struggling to form and the convictions that I was fighting for in the Church of Scotland was allowed to sort of blossom and flourish. And Donald MacLeod taught me Scottish church history and systematic theology, has had a huge influence on me, along with the piety of so many people in the Free Church. Singing psalms had a deeply formative impact upon me. At that time, the Free Church was still an unaccompanied exclusive psalm singing, technically exclusive scripture singing, but that meant in practice mostly singing psalms. And
did the Church of Scotland sing many psalms when you were in it, or they abandoned a lot of that?
If you went to the Isle of Lewis or Isle of Skye or somewhere up in the West Highlands, you would still find congregations that would be identical in practice. You could go from a Free Church congregation into a Church of Scotland congregation on the Isle of Lewis and not know, unless someone told you, that you weren't in a Free Church congregation. There were psalm singing presenters at the front, same sort of preaching, the same theology. as you get further down into the central belt of Scotland, into the bigger cities, depending on how traditional they were, you might hear a psalm. There were psalms in the CH3 Church Hymnary, 3rd edition, was the Church of Scotland's little hymn book. And there were psalms and paraphrases in there, but not a whole psalter. So they would sing some, but there was no convictional inclusive psalmody in the Church of Scotland, really.
So let me. I didn't know that the church in London was your first.
Yeah.
Is that considered a plum post, or is that someplace most of those guys in Scotland don't want to go? I mean, because it's weird. You came in from the outside, and then you got sent south. You know,
Yeah,
not to the borders, but way south.
Yeah.
Well, you know, London, they say it's really going to be something in about 20 years. It's kind of one of those spots where everyone's sort of looking towards.
I loved living in London. It's a fabulous city. And I trained as an artist originally before I went to seminary. And so, you know, if you're an artist, it's a great city to be in, to enjoy the arts, culture, life. You can eat food from everywhere and eat a different cuisine every night of the week. It's just a fabulous, engaging, vibrant place. London City Presbyterian Church, I think it had been without a pastor for nearly 4 years. So it was considered, I think, and may still be considered, an important congregation in the Free Church. It's not a particularly large congregation, but it was. I think it's been historically important to the Free Church of Scotland to have a congregation in London. And yet they couldn't find a Scottish minister who wanted to go there. And you know, that may or may not reflect Scottish attitudes towards the English, but like a lot of guys coming out of seminary, I thought I knew everything and I didn't really know anything. You know, I could preach a sermon, I could love people, but I had no clue about how to be a leader, about how to manage, you know, interpersonal politics. I made a ton of really bad mistakes. I blundered my way through. And, you know, the Free Church has lots of small, vacant pulpits, small congregations. When I graduated from the seminary, there were many, many more vacancies than there were students available to fill them. There is no culture of assistant or associate pastorates like there is in the PCA, where seminarians will typically go to those sorts of first jobs, first calls. In the Free Church, you graduate and you go straight into preaching 3 times a week, leading a session meeting, doing pastoral visitation every day. And the added challenge of London is, as you heard the other day there, is that, you know, a pastoral visit, you might do 2 pastoral visits and it'll take you all day to do it. And that was exhausting to us. You know, London City Presbyterian Church is a pretty vibrant congregation, but it gathers people from all over the Metro London area, which means that getting fellowship together was always a challenge. And I think after 5 years there, we were pretty close to burnout. And really trying to figure out, where do we go next from there. And I had John Payne and I were together in Edinburgh at the same time, and that's where our friendship, he's one of my oldest and dearest friends, that began in Edinburgh. And so I had a number of friends. Guy Richard, who's now president of RTS in Atlanta, was in Edinburgh at that time as well. A number of connections in the United States. And at one point I looked and thought maybe a PCA congregation, but I applied all over the place and nowhere would take me. And so I kind of quit looking. And then a little congregation out of nowhere reached out to me, and Columbus, Mississippi. And Sheena and I sat down and pulled out our atlas, and we had this beautiful big Times of London atlas that someone gave us for our wedding. This big beautiful, massive book. We pulled out the United States and we went looking for Columbus, Mississippi, and we couldn't find it on the map. And I remember Sheena and I looking at each other and thinking, what is it? 11 to, depending on the time of year, maybe 12 million people in London, something like that. There's no way we're going to Columbus, Mississippi.
Well, did you look up on Wikipedia and find the average temperature in August?
No, we did not.
No, that was a mistake.
Yeah. That actually, we may not have gone had we done that. I was coming over for the Twin Lakes Fellowship, which in the providence of God, First Presbyterian Church Jackson has convened and run for more than 20 years now, I think. And my session in London sent me to come to Twin Lakes Fellowship just for my encouragement. And I think I'd been 2 or 3 times. And so when the elders in Columbus found out I was coming over, they asked me to come over. They came down and came to the Twin Lakes Fellowship. And I got to say to them, guys, if you want to know what I'm about, what my philosophy of ministry is, if you'll just keep your eyes and ears open during the Twin Lakes Fellowship, that will give you a much better sense of what I think ministry is than anything I could even articulate to you. And then they had me stay a little longer. They flew Sheena out to join me. I preached in the congregation, and the congregation at that time, I think, were looking for some direction, and were open to being led. And it was an amazingly healthy, happy, satisfying experience pastoring that delightful congregation in Columbus, Mississippi. They loved us so well. We were burning out in London. We landed in Columbus, and they just embraced us and cared for us in a way that maybe only Mississippians can. And they were so hospitable, so generous. And to us, the novelty of being able to leave our home, visit a family in the church for an evening, and get back to our home in 10 minutes, that was just so delightful. And I was settled there and had no intention of moving.
Well, so for years, decades, maybe a century, I don't know when it really started, I think it was largely in PCUS churches, but not exclusively. If you were a tall steeple church in a southern city, you were PCUS. There were some of those churches that sort of saw the liberalizing that was going on, and one of their firewalls against that was to get themselves a Scot, to get a Scot. First Pres of Raleigh had one, and I was a member there 20 years ago, and he had just retired when I went there, but they had a conservative evangelical Scottish minister. First Pres Knoxville had exactly the same thing. One of my fellow elders at my church, I think he used to date the man's daughter. So he'd spent a lot of time around him. His name was Ferguson, of course. And but when those guys died off, that was the end of an era. So it was a sort of brain drain. And I always wondered, what did those those who were left behind in Scotland, were they embittered towards the ones who came to the land of high humidity and good dental care and McDonald's barbecue? So did you deal with any of that? Was there any resentment?
I don't think I ever experienced anyone expressing resentment, although I know and have heard friends like David Robertson, who married my wife and I and is an old friend, expressing regret that there has been a perceived brain drain, or maybe not brain drain in my case, but at least exodus. Congregations.
You've got good hair anyway.
Yeah, it makes up for anything inside. this.
Unlike David Robertson, who does not have good and who is in Australia right now.
He's in Australia now,
Yeah.
But I think I've heard him and others like him say, enlist former Free Church ministers who are now in the States, but my experience has been, I've been able to go back. I've been able to continue to do ministry. I've continued to have good relationships with dear friends. Ivor Martin is a really good friend. Colin Dow, who's the minister in Glasgow City Free Church, is a dear friend, and many others. And I found doors open, and people are grateful to see me, and I'm very thankful that there's no resentment and any of that. And that's and honestly, I think the Free Church of Scotland has benefited from relationships with the PCA a great deal over the years. And I think that keeping those relationships vital and healthy can only be good for both of us, both the PCA and the Free Church.
Describe Columbus, Mississippi to us.
Yeah, so Columbus used to be called Possum Town. Back when it was founded. That may tell you something, I don't know. It was originally the Mayhew Mission was a northern New School Presbyterian mission to Choctaw Indians. And that grew, and Possum Town was the next largest settlement. Eventually was renamed Columbus, Mississippi.
Now it's nestled ever so sweetly halfway between Starkville and Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, it's part of what Mississippi attempts to call the Golden Triangle: Columbus, Starkville, and West Point. I don't know why you're laughing. But,
I'm from across the river in Arkansas, so I can visualize all this.
Yeah. It's about, I think, the greater Columbus area. There's maybe about 30,000 people there, so it's not tiny. So it's a small town, but it has some amenities. It has a little bit of bustle about it. The birthplace of Tennessee Williams, so his house is still proudly there, and I think that's the Tourist Information Center. There's quite a lot of beautiful antebellum homes in Columbus that were never destroyed. I think Columbus in the Civil War became a hospital town, and Friendship Cemetery is there, which lays claim to being it has a Civil War cemetery, and it lays claim to being the place where the poem that inspired the poem "The Blue and the Grey," which I don't know if you know that poem, famous poem about the Civil War, when Columbus women laid flowers on the graves of both Union and Confederate soldiers' graves. So it's kind of there's a neat bit of history there. Main Street Presbyterian Church is the name of the PCA congregation in town. Interestingly, when the PCA was founded, Main Street was a founding member, charter member of the denomination. And unlike many, maybe most charter members of the PCA, Main Street was able to keep its building. And the deal was it split like a lot of churches. And so the body that remained with the PCUS took the name First Presbyterian Church and moved out to another plot of land and built a modern church building. And Main Street kept the original building and then changed its name to the Presbyterian Church of Columbus, Mississippi.
That's a good move. Yeah.
Yeah. And eventually it changed its name to Main Street Presbyterian Church.
So that's, and I have a vague memory because I knew who you were because we had been there in London at one time with you. So I followed you, and you had a blog about this. You sort of your new experience in America, and I have a vague recollection of the church building. So I guess you were glad, probably coming from Scotland, that you weren't in a 1970s A-frame modern atrocity.
Yes and no. I mean, the church building is an interesting one. Like a lot of old church buildings from the 19th century, it was originally a split chancel with a horseshoe shaped sanctuary. So the pews were curved and sloped towards the center, with the communion table kind of at the focal point on the floor. And then at some point they extended it, and so you've got this horseshoe, and then off to the side this straight back row of pews. It's a very odd kind of interior dynamic. Dark wood. It's an old traditional sanctuary. Stained glass windows of bearded figures that I used to tell my children were Gandalf and Dumbledore. And when they asked me that, is that Jesus? I said, no.
No, and you were right. It wasn't. So, and some of the things I've learned, I've talked about this. We'll do a whole show on it sometime. There's a book called When Church Became Theater by a lady whose last name is Kilde, Kilde. A lot of churches that didn't have split chancels adopted them in the early 1900s, and so it may not have always had a split chancel, but the Oxford movement hit about 30 or 40 years late in the United States, and really was sort of the unifying Protestant, American national civic religion force, where Methodists, Episcopalians, even Baptists, some of them, and Presbyterians and Methodists all looked the same.
Right.
Their churches looked the same, and they worshiped the same, and they had choir robes and all that stuff. So
I can't prove this, but I have a sense that whoever the architect was there may have been plans for this church that were just sort of taken off the shelf. And I've seen things that look awfully like Main Street Presbyterian Church all over the South.
Yeah, and there was a sort of a standard PCUS building, and very square corner tower a lot of times.
If you've seen Second Pres in Greenville, where Rick Phillips is,
right? Yeah.
Main Street looks somewhat like that. It's very reminiscent of Main Street.
Yeah, there's a perfect example of it in Knoxville too that I'm thinking of. So, yeah, it was sort of a cookie cutter, just like the the laminate beams A-frame building built between 1962 and 72. There are lots of those too.
Right.
All right. So I gather that your first real experience of America was there in small town Mississippi. We're really sort of a lifestyle show here, so we have to ask you about food. Okay. Tell me about your experience with American food, and we also need to know about your take on barbecue.
Yeah, let's do the barbecue first. I can't say that I'm an aficionado or that I have a preference. I'll just say that all the barbecue that I've eaten, whether it's Texas or Tennessee or Carolina, Memphis barbecue, I really like it all. I love it all. I love different.
You boast the entire catalog.
I'm ecumenical. I'll eat barbecue from all sorts of places and all sorts of people. I think, if I had to pick, I would probably not opt for brisket as my choice. I like it fine. It just tends to get a little dry. Getting good brisket that's still moist and not powdery and dry is a challenge. But I love good barbecue, and I'll eat it all day long.
I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, but people are going to remember that brisket remark more than anything else you say tonight. Like that's going to be, that's what's going to bring the pitchforks out.
That's all right. That's all right.
What's your favorite American chain restaurant?
I try to avoid chain restaurants at all cost. I try to eat clean as I can.
Oh no. Oh no.
So does that mean you're only at Crystal once a week, twice a week? What does this mean?
My kids are Chick-fil-A guys. We have a Schlotzsky's. You have been at a Schlotzsky's?
Oh, yeah.
We used to have those. Yeah.
My wife and my son both have celiac disease, which means they have to be gluten-free, and Schlotzsky's will do their thing on a gluten-free bun, and so I can, and so will Chick-fil-A. You can get gluten-free options there. So my younger son, those are good options when we don't feel like cooking, and we can do something.
So what's your position on Taco Bell?
I have eaten in Taco Bell in my life one time. It was actually when I was picked up from the airport by the secretary of the search committee at Columbus. And on the way back to Columbus, she took us, we stopped at Chick-fil-A, and I was horribly, not Chick-fil-A, Taco Bell. And I was horribly unwell. There were significant and lasting gastrointestinal after effects.
Some people are not strong enough for it.
We call that a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, pink slime. Pink slime is not a foodstuff. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, you know that there are people in London that pay good money for those cleanses, and you got yours for about $3.
You get it for, $4 or $5.
That's right.
Yep. Right.
Well, so you're in the U.S. What was the hardest thing to adapt to? I mean, you can be honest. What's the weirdest, most irritating thing about American culture?
Oh, it's the Mississippi State cowbells. I can already tell you.
I'm not going to comment on the cowbells because I want to keep my job. But
I'm from my mom and her entire side went to Ole Miss, so it's a little slightly more than personal.
If I say in a sermon, God loves rebels, half the congregation cheers and the other half boos.
Yep. Man.
So I got to be real careful about
that's
who I
Jackson.
offend. So the weirdest thing, early on, things that happened, I remember getting a phone call in the first week or 2 weeks, a wrong number. I won't attempt to do the accent, but the wrong number is Charlene there. And I said, no, sorry, you have the wrong number. And the person said, well, are you sure? I said, yes, ma'am. There's no Charlene here. And then there's a long pause, and then they said, mind if I ask you a question? Where are y'all from? And I'm just thinking, I don't know who you are. Why are you still talking to me? And
Chortles, you need to mark that so that we can get a soundbite of that where y'all from.
This wrong number wanted to. They were like, well, if Charlene's not there, I'll just talk to you.
Well, at least you didn't say, what have you done with her?
Yeah, right. Another time, we're still here. First week, the manse was adjacent to the church, and round the corner, about 2 blocks down Main Street, is the bank, and the session clerk is the president of the bank. And so, since we had no credit score in the United States, it really helped to have the president of the local bank help us set up our bank account and all that. So we walk down. It's a beautiful day in the morning. We walk down to the bank, Sheena and I. And by the time we get to the teller's desk, my phone rings again, and it's the administrative assistant at the church. And she said, I saw you walking, and I just wanted to check you were okay. And I thought, sweetheart, we're in America now. Those were early things I miss still. I miss good chocolate. I think Hershey's tastes of baby sick. That's what baby sick smells like. I think Hershey's just weird. Good chocolate I miss. I cannot stand American news.
Oh yeah, thank
Oh,
you.
you either.
I'm not talking about your preferred news outlet. All of them, I can't handle any of them.
Oh, we hate them from the local municipality all the way up to the national syndicates. It's terrible.
Right, they talking over each other, shouting, the kind of crass editorialization, the brazen party politics, the shameless rejection of any pretense at journalistic objectivity. It's very frustrating. I can listen to about 3 minutes and then I have to turn it off.
Oh, here, let me. You might have noticed this too. I heard that there was when you had the Meghan and Harry interview with Oprah, they sent that over to the UK on a raw feed with the American commercials and everything, and everyone in the United Kingdom was aghast that every advertisement was for drugs, for prescription drugs. It's illegal. It's illegal to advertise prescription drugs on TV in England or in Scotland. So you must have noticed that we're pretty well medicated over here.
You might say that. I couldn't possibly comment.
Of course, I know if you need prescription drugs, you may have a hard time getting an appointment with the NHS. One of my friends who's lived in Scotland, he told me about people who, for a procedure that they could have gotten in 2 days here, they would wait 10 months sometimes over there. So there's pluses.
Not said about that is that you can still get private healthcare in the UK. So if you want to pay for it, like you would in the United States, you can have an insurance plan and you can pay and you can get private healthcare and you can get seen in 10 days instead of 10 days. So,
well, it's a good thing Scots aren't cheapskates or anything.
Well, that's a good thing.
Yeah,
it's a good thing.
So yeah, I was going to ask you about the politics, and you sort of brought it up. It's Carl Truman wrote the book Republicrat, and I was going to ask you if your views were more along those lines, or if you just sort of had a studied disdain for it all, which I think is maybe the best way to go.
I think I think I've heard you remark in the past that in Britain, Reformed and evangelical Christians don't necessarily map onto the same sort of political landscape that they would were they in the United States. And you will find really no alignment in the UK between conservative theological and ethical commitments and party politics. So you'll find conservative evangelicals in both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party and in the Liberal Democrats and in the Scottish National Party. Some of those places are easier and some of them are harder to be. All of them, I think, in the UK at the moment are pretty difficult places for Christians to be. And you'll find Christians voting across the spectrum. And of course, in Britain, it's still generally pretty rude to ask someone who they voted for. So we really don't talk about that quite in the same way that Americans want to do. So when I came to the States, I find myself often without much of a political home, finding bits and pieces from all sorts of backgrounds that I resonate with, though, I think that the sort of woke stuff and the LGBTQ stuff makes it very, very hard for someone who's a conservative, Bible-believing Christian to put their vote there. So I actually became a citizen 2 weeks ago, and
congratulations.
Thank you. But up till 2 weeks ago, I was able to say, isn't it a shame? I'm not a citizen, I can't vote. Ask someone else. But now I'm kind of on the horns of that particular dilemma, and I have no idea.
Reminds me of I used to work at a Home Depot many years ago, and you get hired part time, and if you do a good enough job, eventually you might get lucky and say like, hey, we're going to hire you full time now. So you get the guaranteed 40, and everyone's like, well, congratulations, your paycheck's about to double, but also welcome to the rat race.
Right.
So it's sort of the same thing. Welcome to the rat race. Now you have to.
Thank you.
Beatings will continue until you're forced to care.
Brits in America have, generally enjoy a sort of smug, condescending, you poor benighted colonials, sort of superior attitude, which I now can no longer, express, because now I am an American, and so there's that.
I actually wondered.
Has Carl Truman naturalized yet? Has he gotten?
I really doubt it.
I don't think so.
Last of the diehards.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to ask you, but as you said, it was be rude to ask who you voted for in the UK. I thought it'd be rude to ask you if you just had a green card, but that's interesting. Was your
I had a green card and became a citizen. Yeah.
Was your congregation? Were some of them sort of delighted that you were now a citizen, or did they send you condolences?
Yeah, no, I think I've been pushed by people who know to sort of write a little column for our congregational magazine about it all. And I've kind of been resisting, partly because I am so tired of public displays of personal stuff all over the place. I'm just a little worn out by it all. If another notable person, from Meghan and Harry down to PCA ministers, goes on Facebook or Twitter and bears their soul, I'm going to lose it. I'm tired of it. And so I've been kind of resisting that. So not everyone knows. Many of all of the people that I'm close with in the congregation are aware, and they've all been incredibly celebratory and congratulatory, and it's kind of a weird experience becoming it was almost a religious ceremony. It's fine. It was sort of like a conversion thing. Like it's
a second blessing, really.
Baptize me or something. It really felt almost like a revival meeting or something. There's speeches, and everyone has to take the oath together, and you get a certificate, and it's just it's fascinating.
There's probably a judge in a Genevan gown.
There wasn't on this occasion.
Oh, okay.
But there was a lot of sort of emphasis on the gravity of what we're doing, and I appreciated it. I want to take it seriously, and I'm grateful that sort of sense of weightiness was there. But as a pastor, I noted some fascinating. We were all getting converted into Americans in this little ceremony, and it was very interesting.
Well, that would make a good piece if you wrote it, but you certainly don't have to. Maybe you should put it on YouTube.
Yeah.
Get someone to interview you very meaningfully. Well, you're on there now, but this is hardly.
You haven't made
hardly
or anything, or share childhood stories, or relive trauma. So, I'm grateful.
All right. So you didn't stay forever in Columbus, Mississippi. Tell us where you went from there.
Yeah. So in the 5 years at Columbus, I was going to the Twin Lakes Fellowship every year. First Pres Jackson is the largest church in Mississippi in the Presbyterian orbit, certainly. And Ligon and Derek Thomas were the morning and evening preachers there. Ligon had been at First Pres for 17 years, Derek for 13. And Derek moved to go about a year before to go and take up the role at First Pres in Columbia, South Carolina. And that's when about a year later, I received a phone call from a ruling elder on the search committee asking me to consider talking with them about becoming their Sunday evening preacher. And that progressed pretty rapidly. I was not looking to move at all when that conversation happened. Was very settled and content in Columbus. And it was really surprised by the phone call and the invitation. I went to talk to my elders in Columbus, and they all said, look, we don't really want you to go, but we think this might be what the Lord is calling you to. And, we'll support you in that. That may have been a polite Southern way of saying, off you go and don't let the door hit you on the way out. But that wasn't how I took it, at least. I took it as, gracious, costly confirmation.
Did they say, bless your heart?
They did not. So I wasn't worried about being stabbed in the back or anything.
Okay, good.
That's the tell, isn't it? Bless your heart, you watch out. They didn't say that. And so I remember when it was getting serious, the conversation with First Pres, calling Derek up and saying, Derek, I think the search committee are getting a lot of information. They're asking what they need to know from me, but I don't think I know much about First Pres yet. And so he helped me with that, and we talked about that. And then he said to me, David, you need to understand that Mike Milton, who was then the Chancellor of RTS, is unwell, and there's a possibility that he will retire anytime from, a year from now to 5 years from now. And if that happens, RTS will come after Ligon to be the next Chancellor with everything it's got. And there's really no other job in the world that Ligon would want to do other than First Pres than the Chancellorship of RTS. And I remember thinking to myself, even if I get just a year with Ligon, but 5 years would be great, just to sit under his ministry and have him shape me and mentor me. That would be awesome. So I take the call. We move to Jackson. On day one, Ligon and Ralph Kelly, the executive pastor, and I go out to lunch to celebrate. I've arrived day one on the job. And Ligon's in the car on front, and Ralph and I are in the car behind on the way back to church after lunch, when Ralph's phone pings with a Facebook announcement. Mike Milton announces his retirement as the Chancellor of RTS. So we get Ligon on the phone, on the speakerphone, and we say, hey, boss, something you want to tell us? Ligon's like, what are you talking about? And Mike Milton has just posted his resignation online. And there was like 30 seconds of complete silence. It was completely news to Ligon. Within the year, he was gone. And I then had the excruciating experience of being a candidate. In most situations, the candidate comes in, preaches, and then leaves. Except I was there the whole time. Every time I preached, I'm thinking, man, if I tank, you die by the last decent, the last sermon you preach. If you tank, that's it, you're curtains. And that was a very odd experience. And they called me to be the next senior minister 7 years ago last week. I got a year as an assistant, and then I've been the senior pastor now for 7 years. They've been incredibly patient with me, really.
So your trajectory has been unusual and steep. What's it like pastoring one of the, and I don't know size-wise anymore if it's top 10 in the PCA, but certainly very influential. A lot of history with the PCA. What is it like?
It's about 2,400 members. I think the biggest I mean, the biggest challenge coming in on the front end was the steepest learning curve. I had, we don't have quite this many now, but I had 60 elders, ruling elders.
6-0.
60.
Yes.
And a similar number of deacons. We now have nearly 100 deacons.
Wow.
And so session meetings, I have a gavel. We have a white book with committee reports. It's a presbytery meeting, effectively. That was a very steep learning curve. The first couple of years of session meetings were nerve-wracking because in Columbus, when you've got 5 elders, I don't think we ever did anything by Robert's rules. We just talked until we had consensus. So our meetings would last till 11 o'clock at night. At First Pres, session meetings last 2 hours, always. And we spend 30 minutes of that in prayer for the congregation. These men love their flock. I always leave those meetings thinking, I'm so grateful for the wisdom of the elders. I may not always agree. There may even sometimes be heated debate, but very often I go in thinking this is what I think it should be, and leave with my mind changed because of the way the argument has gone and the debate has happened. And I praise God for that dynamic. I think if I were not convictionally a Presbyterian, pragmatically, I would still advise it because it's so helpful to see men operate like that. So, yeah, big challenges in terms of just how do you lead? How do you shepherd? I'll say that it is the sweetest, easiest place to preach I've ever preached in. The congregation, I mean, after 17 years of Ligon's ministry and 13 of Derek's ministry, you come in after that, and if you just say, look at verse 1, here's what it means, here's the difference it makes, now let's look at verse 2, and you do it kindly and communicate that you love your people in the preaching of the word, they're grateful, and they want the word preached. And so for a preacher, it's a delight, to say, open your Bibles to, and then you hear sort of the waves lapping on the shore as people turn. There's that beautiful noise of Bible pages turning throughout the congregation. That I've preached in lots of places, both in the UK and in the US, where when you say, take your Bibles and let's look at, or turn to, and nobody moves. And nobody looks down when you say look down at the text. Nobody moves. That's not the case at First Pres. People, and if a guest preacher comes in and they don't preach the text, I hear about it from our congregation. That's really Ligon and Derek's legacy. They were such faithful expositors that, simple, straightforward expository preaching is what the congregation love and want, and so it's a delight. It really is a delight to preach there. Yeah.
Well, that's encouraging, and I'm sure I'm sure it's a one-of-a-kind place in many ways, but there are many good churches that would be similar to that too. So that's encouraging to hear that you were well received there, and but that's uniquely challenging with that many officers and a congregation of that size. So
yeah.
Well, we should. You said if you weren't convictionally Presbyterian, if you ran into somebody on the street and you had to tell them in 2 minutes why you're a Presbyterian and why they ought to be, how would you do that?
Well, I'd start by talking about our theology before I talked about our ecclesiology, because I think our doctrine of the church arises from our convictions about God and man, about sin and grace, about God's sovereignty and our depravity. And then I'd simply point them to the interchangeability of the word for elder and bishop and pastor in the New Testament scriptures. I would demonstrate that there are a plurality of elders in almost every church in the New Testament that I can, you can't demonstrate that from every church that's mentioned, but in many places you can show a plurality of elders, bishops, overseers, pastors. I can also point out the fact that there are clearly multiple congregations meeting in a given location that are addressed as the church in. And then, of course, there's the Jerusalem Council, which is a clear expression of how churches operate collegially. And so the rudiments, at least, of a graded system of courts, the New Testament doesn't use that word, but it's a helpful word because courts don't make laws, or at least without getting into politics again, they're not supposed to make laws. They're meant to rule on the basis of the laws that's given. We rule on the basis of the word of God that is the given. We don't create rules. We simply make judgments based on the rule that God has given us in his word. And so it's helpful to talk about it in terms of a court. That's why we talk about a session. It means to sit like judges in a courtroom to rule. That's probably how I'd do it. And I'd say, the great practical benefit of this, Joe Baptist, is if somebody disciplines you in your church, you're done. That's it. And if a miscarriage of justice takes place, you have no recourse. Pastoral abuse can run rampant in your system with very little, or even the abuse of pastors by a congregation or by other officers can happen with very little recourse. But in a Presbyterian system, there's always a court of appeal. There's somewhere you can go to ask, is this just? Is this according to the word of God? Is this consistent with your standards and your book of church order? Those things are written and they're out in the open for anyone to consult and scrutinize and measure behavior and action and polity against. And that's an immensely helpful, wise thing. The checks and balances of that system are incredibly helpful.
Yeah, that's very, very good. And you mentioned a word that made me think of something else I wanted to ask about coming to America. All the Baptists, you just don't have that many of them in England and Scotland, although you had a very famous one back in the 19th century in Spurgeon. But what's it like, life among the Baptists?
You mean here?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll just say I never met an Arminian on purpose until I came to America. So I'm really serious about that. I knew people who just hadn't really thought their way through some of these issues. As a student in university, in the Universities and Colleges Christian Fellowship, which is the UK arm of InterVarsity, but much more conservative, I think, than InterVarsity would be here. There were Arminians there, but I don't think any of them were doctrinally, convictionally Arminian. They just sort of were Arminian by default. But the majority report in British evangelicalism is something close to Calvinism, if not always that robust. And then I never met the sort of Arminian trending toward Pelagian, pragmatic, manipulative stuff that you see in some revivalistic circles in the United States until I landed here. And in Columbus, the Pentecostal church have a hell house that they put out at Halloween. Oh, yeah. I don't know if they still do, but they did, at least for a while when we were there. And just stuff like that blew me away, because I was like, I'd read about Charles Finney and the New Measures and all of that, but I never thought to see them quite vastly alive and well.
Well, we've improved on them a great deal.
There are endless variations, but it's essentially the same. They're just riffing on the same thing, aren't they? And yeah, the simplicity of the ordinary means of grace, the word, the sacraments, and prayer, the people of God praying, pleading with the Lord, the faithful preaching of the word, no frills, straight up and down. Here's what the text means. Apply it to my heart and my conscience. In this context, actually, it's revolutionary. It's I find it fascinating, the debates that we have within our own circles, that Presbyterians are almost embarrassed by who they are. Coming in from outside, looking at the sort of the pragmatism all around us, how incredibly relevant and challenging and countercultural and refreshing the simplicity of Reformed worship and Reformed church life and Reformed ministry really can be when it's done well. It doesn't have to be ugly. It can be winsome. It doesn't have to be, obtuse and awkward. It can be attractive without being attractional. It can speak to the conscience. It can be pastoral. It can be stirring and moving without it being emotionally manipulative. And I mean, it was my experience in Columbus. It's been my experience here in Jackson that people often coming from Baptist and Church of Christ and even some like independent fundamental Bible church backgrounds are kind of blown away by it. You're just singing the word, praying the word, preaching the word. That's it. And there's something about that if they'll just give it a couple of weeks, if they'll just hang in and not react too quickly, starts to really change their paradigm in ways that I find thrilling.
Well, so we touched on Baptist, and you did that in a frank but still winsome way. You've probably heard you're too dignified a guest for us to have a fun with Baptist segment.
Man, I wish you would. I love those segments. I was actually thinking to myself before we started. I hope he does one.
I just didn't have time to get one of those together, but let's talk about as we wrap up the challenges that the PCA faces, and I think you might say that this desire to be relevant and to be something other than or less than or maybe more than Presbyterian might drive the pragmatism that we might see, and the desire to contextualize and the motivation may be good, but I think we probably see some similarities between evangelical pragmatism and what may be steering us in the wrong way in some cases. But what do you think about the state of the PCA without being, terribly negative or accusatory, and the challenges that we face? Because they're there.
Right. I mean, I think you're right that historically speaking, the PCA has always had aspirations to be, a culture-shaping, culturally influential national church. I think Sean Lucas likes to say that PCA is really a conservative mainline denomination in its soul. I don't know if I completely buy that, but he's trying to get at something that I think has some resonance at least. There is this big slice of the PCA in its DNA from the very beginning, even before joining and receiving, from the right from the start, that was revivalistic, that was sort of Billy Graham evangelicals that baptize babies and believe in predestination. There's a big chunk of the PCA and the fathers of the PCA who were very much in that mold. And not all of that is bad. That drive to see people converted. I don't want conservative confessional men among whom I count myself, ordinary means men, to become so afraid of the most extreme expressions of sort of pop evangelical pragmatism that we lose a longing to see sinners saved, to call people to repentance and faith. I think that's a part of who we are, and it's a good part of who we are. But I do think that drive sometimes for relevance gives us aspirations that drive us in directions that are not always fruitful or beneficial. I think where we are right now, in many ways, is reflective of where society is, and we're having the same discussions within the denomination that the country is having on the political stage about race, about identity politics, about sexuality. We're having exactly the same conversations. And they're pretty tense, to be honest, and a lot's at stake. And I think, how to put this, I think there's a lot of sort of jumping on the bandwagon and uncritically adopting slogans and phraseology because it's just sort of in the air that we breathe. And before you know it, we're talking about, I mean, you joke about your authentically broken journey, but the reason that you joke about that is because that's language that we hear all over the place. We're living at a time, my wife and I have been talking about this all week, where speech is now a form of violence, and where being offended is trauma. And so everybody's vocabulary is ratcheted all the way up to 9, which makes having meaningful discussion on points where we disagree really fraught and really difficult. So even getting to the realization where brothers that are perhaps closer than they realize are talking past one another, just getting to that place, which used to be possible, is getting harder and harder to do, because the tension that fills the vocabulary that we use is so cranked up. And people are getting, to use another slogan, they're getting triggered all over the place. They're getting offended. We're signaling our virtue. We're trying to play the victim card every chance we get. And it makes having a conversation almost impossible. That actually really worries me about the future of the PCA. If we can't just dial it down and take some of the heat out of all of this, I fear for us. We can do better. We ought not to mimic the world in these debates. I may have opponents in the PCA, but I do not have any enemies, at least none that I'm aware of. Maybe after this podcast, but not before.
Well, how about a nemesis? I like a good nemesis.
I don't think I even have a nemesis. I have people that I disagree with, who probably would disagree with me, but I can look him in the eye and call him my brother. And that matters to me, to be able to do that. And I worry about both poles of our denomination using incendiary rhetoric and mischaracterizing each other for their own ends. What that does is it stops us really getting to the real issues where we actually do disagree. Like, what role ought our confession, our standards to play? Not just in, jumping a hoop to become a PCA ruling elder or teaching elder, but in your ministry, in your church life, in your piety, and the way you frame theology. Those kind of things really matter. But we can't get to that because everybody's tinkering with identity politics and being mad at each other at the drop of a hat. And I'm alarmed by that.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting year. I think we'll probably meet in June, July. I think that's going to happen, and it's in sort of a driving distance for you, and would hope to see you at General Assembly. I hope.
I look forward to that.
Will you be coming over to the GRN conference?
Yeah, I've been asked to speak about confessional integrity in the PCA. So,
Oh, okay. I was looking at the agenda schedule today, and I missed that. But
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
Well, it'd be good to meet you there. Anything else you'd like to say about the PCA or?
Yeah, I thought I might try and be cheeky and say that I heart the PCA, but this is probably the wrong podcast for that. I actually love the PCA. I think there's a at our best, there's a healthy Catholicity of spirit, a charity exercised towards one another around a set of shared convictions about truth and the church and the gospel. That as I look around the landscape, the denominational landscape in the United States, I just don't find mirrored quite in the same way anywhere else. You know, I sometimes joke with our interns that the PCA is the worst denomination in America, except for all the others. You know, to kind of riff on Churchill. So.
Yep. Yeah, we've heard that before. So one question I had. Well, I wanted to say. I'd like to commend you for being. Though you're at a very large church, I've never got the sense that you were seeking publicity or trying to build a brand or speak at this conference and that conference. And
that's only if nobody would buy it. If I tried to build the brand, it just would never get off the ground. It'd be the lamest brand ever.
Just use Carl Truman's name. It'd be fun.
I appreciate you saying that. I've always, I think, you know, I'm a proud sinner, and I'm just terrified of self-promotion because it's the death of usefulness. I think I try to tell our interns, your gifts will make room for you. Be a man of God. You don't need to force it. It's not that I haven't applied for lots of things, but no job I've ever applied for have I ever gotten. Everyone said no every time I've asked, but all the opportunities for ministry that have come to me have come without me seeking them. And I tried to make that a principle in my approach to ministry is not to put myself forward. That's not to say that I don't have an ego the size of Montana. It's just to say that I think I have enough self-awareness to know that I must not allow that ego to run free too much, or it will destroy me and others along with me.
That's probably one of the more important things those interns are hearing from you, I'd have to say, as I look around. So may the tribe of those who are not trying to build a platform increase.
Amen.
So we do look forward to meeting you in person someday. Maybe I should be at the GRN conference. I think I have 5 minutes. You have an hour. I have 5 minutes to promote more in the people.
You're doing more. That's great.
More in the yes.
I'm so pleased you're doing that. That's such an important ministry.
Well, we hope you can scare up about 50 ruling elders in Mississippi for us, and
yes, sir.
We'll try to help them get there. We're going to have John Payne on sometime before the conference.
Good. I hope you give him a really hard time.
Oh yeah. Well, I have a story. Going way back, and it's going to embarrass him and myself.
You need to ask him about hard tackles on the soccer field.
Oh, he posted a picture.
Yeah.
He posted yeah. See, that's something you would never do, I can tell. But
Well, I've managed to destroy all the pictures of me in my younger days. I had hair past my shoulders and sideburns that came all the way out to here. I thought they were things of beauty. Then I met my wife, and that all changed like that.
Yeah.
The sideburns went away pretty quick.
Yeah. Well, you still got your hair, and that's good.
For the time being.
Yes. Well, thanks for being with us, and maybe we'll do it again. If you get a bee in your bonnet or something you need to talk about, you know how to find us.
Yes, sir.
And it's been good to talk to you. And Resby, as always, will tell everyone good night. And I'm sure he's enjoyed this as much as I have.
Yeah, it's sometimes I wonder who felt more foreign in Mississippi sometime, because I even though my mom's side is from there, I grew up in Michigan a lot. So going from Michigan down to Mississippi in the summers, it not a totally dissimilar culture shock sometime. But thank you, Pastor, for coming on. Thank you to everyone for watching along or listening along, depending on when you choose to impose that upon yourself. But we're Presbycast. You can find us all on Twitter. Most of the time, that's where we are. And above all, as we sign off and you go off to stay up too late watching college basketball, please don't be a nerdman.
Crying holy to the Lord, crying holy unto the Lord. Oh, if I could, I surely would stand on the rock where Moses stood.
Magic on the internet worldwide.
Thanks, fellas. Enjoyed being with you.